deserve to be happy? Genuinely, every single person watching this, go look in the mirror after this stream, go into the bathroom, look in the mirror. Do you deserve to be happy? Look yourself in the eye.
I think very three-dimensionally. I don't think in the black and white lines that I've been programmed to think in. And I think in full color.
Always take into account the cost of what you're doing now. Right? Because what people tend to think is whatever I'm doing now is risk-free, and here's a bunch of options. It's like, no.
So thing number one I want to share with you is to wake up early and stack wins, right? Wake up early and stack wins. What I mean about...
Think of the last time you heard general advice. Was it true? Actually, scratch that. Let's think of great advice, iconic advice, and let us try and poke holes in its validity. Number 1, never give up. Unless you're a serial killer, then maybe you ought to give up. Or if you're still following that business venture which is destined to fail, or if you're still hanging on to that ex who already moved on. Sometimes giving up is a form of success, so sometimes give up, other times don't. Number 2, stay curious. What if you're obsessed with whether you're predisposed to a disease, and yet knowing won't serve you any clear benefit because there's no cure anyway? What if you're trying to poke in your partner's past when they're not comfortable discussing it? What if you're better off not knowing some things, like how much more your equally skilled coworker is making, or just how faith-based day-to-day thinking is, or just how likely it is that your life is a simulation and nothing is actually real? So, I guess don't stay curious. Be curious, but be smart about it. Number 3, take responsibility. Always? I mean, taking the advice at face value seems to suggest that it's always, but what if you're not the one in the wrong, and the responsibility should rather be on a different person? Should you always be the bigger one? Should you maximize how much responsibility you take, or is it more nuanced than simply taking responsibility whenever you can?
God is saying, you know what? I'm tired of being the bigger man. My grandfather said, boy, if you got to keep always being the bigger man, you're hanging around with too many small damn people. I'm not finna be the bigger man. I'm not going to let you keep taking your shots at me and I turn the other cheek. That's in the Bible. I ain't in there. I'm going to put something on you.
I guess it depends. Number 4, listen more than you talk. Are you sure? To whom is this advice given? What if you're a scientist trying to approach a medical issue with nuance and yet you're being constantly berated by news reporters? Are you going to continually listen to them more than you speak? What if you're surrounded by people who are missing your point? Is listening to their 10th reiteration more productive than simply talking more effectively, and thereby perhaps talking more than you listen? I guess it's more nuanced than that. Number 5, embrace failure. What if you're not the one at fault, and neither is your team? What if you're being unjustly competed against by a monopolistic company, using shady practices? What if your football team was robbed by a paid referee? What if the judges were in the pockets of one of the contenders? Or what if you simply embraced failure so much that even the idea of winning is becoming more and more out of reach? I guess don't embrace failure, welcome it, but draw your limits. I hope I made my point clear by now. Any piece of general advice seems to have an edge case, which isn't always as esoteric as you might think. Of course, I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek here. Those pieces of advice aren't false or even flawed, but when taken as general advice, they must be approached with nuance. But why are they problematic to start? Surely if the edge cases I brought up were common, the advice I displayed wouldn't be repeated so often. So maybe what I highlighted are indeed exceptions. And as the saying goes...
or creatively or whatever it is.
Yeah, you can't make rules for the exceptional.
Right.
You know, they do what they're going to do. Those are open, maybe those are open people. They have genius level IQ. Like they're spectacular in some manner. And so there's a reason they're going to step outside the norm. They're shapeshifters. No problem. There's always going to be people like that, and we need them.
How do they know when they're that?
However, I don't take that as a given. In societally corrupt environments, when dealing with fallible humans, hostile individuals, mentally ill persons, uncertain patients, it isn't guaranteed that your advice will mostly land the way you think it will. Another way to envision this way of thought is that even if the edge cases aren't common or probable, that 1% chance of you screwing it up might cost someone a heavy thing. Yet, how come? How did we get to a point of recognizing this general advice, which seems, at least to an extent, a bit problematic? I personally think it's what expectedly happens when you generalize. Because you're probably telling me right now, when I give advice, I don't give it to the people out of nowhere, I give it to someone, like my friend in a given context, in which case it seems like this problem is circumvented. When your friend comes talking to you about his partner cheating for the third time, you probably don't tell them, don't give up. You might instead tell them, learn to let go and move on. Similarly, when your friend complains about how their coworker is late on their project proposal, you don't tell them, take responsibility, you tell them to stand up to their coworker, to get them to resolve their issue. Yet, even this form of advice given seems to hit a roadblock, because it simply shifts the perspective from scrutinizing general advice to scrutinizing your supposedly less problematic contextual advice. For one, it presupposes your advice is well and sound, which in of itself rests on multiple presuppositions, one of which is that you understand the situation adequately enough to give advice to begin with, both of which are not that certain. After all, we're all familiar with people who were calling one thing, whereas the real unfolding was something different. So maybe your friend does need to take responsibility because they purposely believed in their coworker even when they gave them no reason to. Perhaps your friend shouldn't give up on their cheating partner because they didn't actually cheat, they were merely messaging a coworker. Of course, all of this is more or less hypothetical, and thankfully, in the real world, things don't always tend to unfold this way. And being self-aware of how problematic your supposedly correct advice can be is a double-edged sword. It's how you end up giving advice yet always ending it with, or I don't know, just in case it's downright horrible. That being said, I still think it's worth it. In my opinion, generally, we should try and shy away from general advice, such as stay curious, and definitely advice like never give up, which insinuates it can't ever be the case that you shouldn't take it. And instead, we replace it with more nuance. That's because general advice works like a principle, and as it turns out, drawing principles is a lot more difficult than what people might think, specifically because it seems like edge cases can always be brought up, edge cases that genuinely matter and therefore should be accounted for in your original statement.
Or it means that the principle sort of never actually existed.
Yeah.
Right? And that's why I say I'm more in the camp of saying, like, you think you've got a principle, but all you've got is a general rule of thumb that you haven't found a counterexample to yet. And trivially, if you want to be like a pedantic philosopher type, you can always think up some ludicrous, obvious counterexample. Oh, you're in favor of free speech. What if, like, supporting this person's free speech meant that every single person on planet Earth was, like, brutally, like, burned in a fire for 1 billion years? Like, okay, obviously then I'm not going to stick to my principle. But then what is a principle? As I say, it's just a general rule of thumb to which you haven't thought of an example or haven't found an example in the real world that approximates the obviousness of that kind of wrong. And so I'm quite pessimistic about the idea of principle as a whole. I mean, people say...
Furthermore, advocating for more nuance, any statement not approached with nuance can technically be true. Diet soda is bad for you. Well, yeah, but also no. If you're someone hopping off regular soda and switching it for diet soda, it can be more beneficial. But if you're someone who never drank any, yet began drinking diet soda, especially regularly, it can indeed be bad for your health. This creeps up against the law of the excluded middle, that every statement posing a question, such as are tigers a mammal, is either answered by yes or no, never something else. I personally am not the biggest fan of this law, since it can be largely unrealistic, but as Simon Blackburn noted in his book Think,
perhaps someone might feel coerced by the assumption mentioned right at the outset that every proposition is true or false, and no proposition is both. Perhaps we ought to try more complex assumptions. For instance, we might welcome vague propositions that are true to a degree, or propositions that are neither true nor false, but have some third status. That is fine too. These are respectable ideas, and there are alternative logics that develop them. But it is fair to warn that for various reasons, they become awkward and uncomfortable. It is usually wise to be grateful for the simple, two-valued assumption.
if advice is either legitimate or non-legitimate, it helps us do away with the gray areas which might result in negative consequences. But then again, unfortunately, most cases are not this dichotomous, further exemplifying why I think it depends as a hallmark of giving good advice. Now, all of this is well and good, but is it even a problem? I think that yeah. Advice is how you shape your life, and the advice you give is how you shape the lives of others. So if there's something deeply flawed about the way we approach it, at least generally, then we ought to fix it. I know that taken alone, I technically committed the ought is fallacy, but I'm assuming we all agree on general principles and ethics, so in that case I can indeed make that statement, given that we're all working towards minimizing suffering and maximizing pleasure some way or another. So, how might one solve this? I think there is a good all-rounded methodology that can aid us in lessening the magnitude of this issue. Whenever you intend to give advice, run it through this process. Number 1. Do you understand the issue at hand? Just ask again. Make sure you do. And if unsure, always preface your advice with, given what I know which seems to be XYZ, I think you should ABC. Number 2. Is advice even necessary? Seriously. Like the quote goes, if you don't have to make a decision, then don't. The same thing applies here. If there's nothing to fix, they don't haphazardly try to do so. You might advise to wait it out and stay keen, which in of itself is debatable, but it's just another way of saying the situation isn't as problematic as you might think, so don't cling onto any advice or look for any decision to make. Number 3. Are you fit to give advice? Don't be afraid to say I don't know or I'm not sure, but worry that your advice might be incomplete due to your credentials. So if you can, refer the advisee to someone you genuinely believe will be of more help. That being said, don't delegate simply because you doubted yourself, since that doubt could very well be unwarranted, so being self-aware is generally what actually matters. Number 4. Filter your advice. Let's say you understand the issue, it's a real issue that demands solving, and you're the right person for the job. The next step would be to filter your advice. Be specific, with sufficient nuance. Go from a run-on sentence to a few words. When words are vague, they can cloud the mind and therefore possibly not be sound. But when they're straightforward and concise, they usually land better. This step helps us near closer to the aforementioned law, as in, the more specific a question, the more precise its answer. For example, is diet soda bad? Might not be the most appropriate question. Instead, is diet soda bad for me? Seems more potent. Just 2 words effectively flipped the question on its head and thus made it 10 times more answerable. And finally, step number 5. Be relatively certain that your advice works. For instance, you can imagine what might unfold if the advisee did take it. Do you think it's more probable they'll fix their problem, or that they'll still be in a ditch? Have you tried this advice before? Did you hear it from someone reputable? Does it account for nuance? The questions here can be damn near infinite, but it is for a good reason. As ironic as it might sound, don't overthink it too much. You want to know when to draw the limit. And one particularly useful way of doing this is to run the advisee through your thought process. Don't let your thoughts become a black box to them. After all, they're the ones whose life is at stake. Perhaps merely your reasoning can be helpful, especially in the long term, instead of your bite-sized, perhaps cookie-cutter ultimate advice. In conclusion, I don't want the video to sound nihilistically skeptical. I am not that type, believe me. I still think general advice can be pragmatic and perhaps even abstractly true, even if it's not approached with somewhat extreme edge case skepticism. I don't think principles are merely rules of thumb and so on, but I think that thinking our advice through is a good and solid step towards making the world a better place. I know this video is not complete, especially since after all, even the advice I just gave you can be scrutinized, so admittedly, it is a bit paradoxical. And the inverse issue of how to accept advice is such a can of worms that I'm considering writing a whole book about it. All in all, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it thought-provoking at the very least. I love engaging in small-time thinking like this, and I believe everyone might have something to learn from doing so. As always, stay true and healthy. Or, I don't know.